Captain Marcus Donovan had never imagined that a simple diplomatic mission would lead him to something as strange as this. The planet Horus was lush, its jungles thick with ancient trees, and the air thick with mystery. The human delegation had arrived with peaceful intentions, but Marcus, ever the explorer at heart, had been drawn away from the group. His curiosity had led him into the heart of a hidden temple, one that seemed untouched by time. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old stone and forgotten history. The walls of the temple were covered in intricate carvings that spoke of battles fought long before humans even discovered space travel. Marcus moved carefully, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he wandered deeper into the ruins. But then he saw it. A pedestal bathed in the soft glow of an unseen light, and upon it lay the sword. It was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The blade shimmered with an otherworldly light, and its hilt was wrapped in strange, glowing symbols. There was no doubt in his mind that it was more than just a weapon. It radiated power, ancient and mysterious, as if it held the very essence of the planet itself within its steel. Despite the warnings in the ancient texts he'd seen back on Earth, Marcus couldn't resist. He reached out and grasped the sword, feeling a surge of energy rush through him. The moment his fingers wrapped around the hilt, the temple seemed to come alive. The walls vibrated, and the ground shook beneath him. It was as if the sword itself was awakening after a long slumber. Before Marcus could comprehend what was happening, a voice rang out, deep and resonant, echoing through the temple. "You have taken what is not yours." Marcus spun around, searching for the source of the voice. It wasn't until he turned toward the entrance of the temple that he saw her, a tall, imposing figure, her presence radiating authority. The woman stood with her arms crossed, her eyes glowing like two bright stars in the darkened space. She was clad in intricate armor, adorned with markings that suggested power and royalty. This was no mere warrior. This was Queen Zahar, the ruler of the Shirik people, a species known for their unmatched strength and mystical abilities. Marcus felt his heart race, realizing he had made a grave mistake. The sword was not a mere artifact. It was sacred to her. And he, a human, had taken it. Zahar's eyes narrowed, her gaze never leaving him. "You are brave, human, to take what belongs to the Shirik. But do you understand the power you now wield? It is not meant for your kind." Marcus, still holding the sword, felt the weight of her words. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. The sword had been a mystery to his people, something that had only been mentioned in passing stories and myths. But now it was his responsibility, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. I didn't mean to take it," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I found it, and I thought, maybe I could return it to you." Queen Zahar stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. She stared at him for a long moment, studying him as if deciding what to do with this strange human who had somehow stumbled upon her sacred blade. Her voice was calm but heavy with power. "The sword cannot be returned, human. Not without consequences." Marcus swallowed hard. He had unknowingly unleashed something far bigger than himself, and now he had to face the consequences. Queen Zahar stood before Marcus, her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being weighed and measured. The sword in his hand, still glowing faintly, seemed to pulse with power, as if reacting to her presence. The air between them was thick with tension, and Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been so close to someone so powerful, someone who commanded both fear and respect. "You dare return it to me now?" Zahar's voice was calm but filled with an unspoken fury. Her hands were still crossed over her chest, her posture regal, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of something that Marcus couldn't quite place. Disappointment? Confusion? Or was it something deeper? Marcus, still holding the sword, stepped forward cautiously. "I didn't know," he said, his voice sounding small in the vast silence of the temple. "I didn't mean to take it. I found it. And I thought it was the right thing to do, to return it to you." Zahar stared at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of centuries of history, of power, of duty. Finally, she spoke, her tone softer but still commanding. "You have returned it, human. But the sword is no ordinary weapon. It is not a relic to be treated lightly. You have no understanding of its significance." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had known the sword was important, but he hadn't realized just how much. The Sherik people had legends about the sword, stories that spoke of its power to change the fate of worlds. But Marcus hadn't believed them, until now. "I didn't know it would cause this much trouble," he said, lowering the sword slightly, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "I only wanted to do the right thing." Zahar's gaze softened, just for a moment. She took a step closer to him, her eyes still sharp but not as cold as before. "You are a fool, human, but you are an honest one. Perhaps there is something in you that I did not expect." Marcus blinked, surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" Zahar's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, though there was no warmth in it. "For centuries, the Sherik have ruled with strength and wisdom. I have never met anyone, alien or human, who would return what they had claimed without question. You are different, but that does not change the fact that you have touched something that was never meant for your kind." Marcus looked down at the sword again. It was as if it were calling to him, its power resonating deep within him. He felt a strange connection to it, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a part of him now, just as much as it was a part of her. Zahar seemed to sense his inner turmoil. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked quietly. "The bond between you and the sword. It is no mere object. It is a living force, and it has chosen you. But I cannot let it fall into the wrong hands. If you wield it, you will be responsible for its consequences." Marcus swallowed, the weight of her words settling in. "I didn't ask for this," he murmured. Zahar's eyes softened again, just a little. "No one ever does. But now that it has chosen you, you must learn to control it, whether you want to or not." For the first time, Marcus understood that this was more than just a mistake. This was the beginning of something far bigger than he could have imagined. He wasn't just a diplomat anymore. He was part of something ancient, something vast, and the choices he made from this point on would shake the future of not just him, but the galaxy itself. And despite the fear rising in him, despite the uncertainty, he knew there was no turning back. The words Zahar spoke echoed in Marcus's mind long after she had left the temple, taking the sword with her. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. The bond between him and the sword was undeniable, and though he hadn't asked for it, it seemed to be choosing him. But Zahar had warned him. Wielding such power came with a price, and Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready to pay it. The journey back to the Sherik capital was quiet. Zahar, though still cold and distant, had agreed to bring him along, saying he needed to learn more about the sword's power. Her ship, sleek and silent, cut through the stars, and Marcus found himself staring out at the endless void of space, lost in thought. He hadn't been prepared for any of this. A human like him was supposed to be a visitor in these distant worlds, not a key player in their ancient struggles. As they arrived at the Sherik city, Marcus's mind raced. The city was a marvel, its towering spires and shimmering bridges a testament to the advanced technology of the Sherik. Yet there was something old here, something ancient that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. The sword had to be part of it. Somehow, it was tied to the very heart of this place, and now it was tied to him. Zahar led him through the grand palace, the walls lined with statues of ancient Sherik warriors, their eyes watching them as they passed. She didn't say much as they walked, but Marcus could feel the weight of her thoughts. She was thinking about the sword and about him. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake in coming here. But there was no turning back now. They reached a large chamber, its walls adorned with more intricate carvings, and in the center, a pedestal stood, much like the one in the temple. Zahar placed the sword upon it with a careful, almost reverent touch. For a moment, Marcus thought she might say something, but she remained silent. The sword hummed, faintly, as if alive, and Marcus felt the strange pull in his chest again. "It is more than just a weapon," Zahar said softly, her voice distant. "It is a key to an ancient power that could either save or destroy us all." Marcus looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? How is it a key?" Zahar turned to him, her eyes serious. "The sword was created by an ancient race, one that predates even my people. They were the ones who discovered the true nature of the universe's energy, and they used that knowledge to create the sword. It is a gateway capable of unlocking unimaginable power that could either heal or harm." "Why didn't you stop me?" Marcus asked, the question tumbling out before he could stop it. Zahar's expression softened for a moment. "Because it is not so simple. The sword has chosen you, and once it has chosen, there is no going back. But that power comes with a curse. Those who wield the sword are bound to it, and the energy it releases will eventually consume them." Marcus's heart sank. "Consume me? What do you mean?" "The sword feeds on the life force of its bearer," she explained. "The more power you draw from it, the more it will take from you. It is a slow process, but it is inevitable. Eventually, you will lose yourself to it." Marcus felt a wave of dread wash over him. The sword was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Yet, something deep inside him knew that he couldn't just walk away from it. The connection was too strong. The bond had already been forged. Zahar studied him closely, her gaze searching. "You have a choice, human. You can walk away now, leave the sword behind, and live a life free from its curse. Or you can accept its power and learn to control it. But know this, if you choose the latter, there will be consequences." Marcus swallowed hard. His mind raced, but he already knew what his answer had to be. The sword had chosen him, and whether he liked it or not, he was already bound to it. There was no going back now. He would have to face whatever challenges lay ahead, even if it meant risking everything. "I'll learn to control it," he said, his voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Zahar nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then prepare yourself. The journey ahead will not be easy." The days that followed were filled with tension. Marcus found himself spending more time with Queen Zahar, training and learning about the sword's powers. Zahar guided him through rituals designed to help him control the sword's energy, but every time Marcus grasped the hilt, the pull of the power felt stronger. He could feel the sword's hunger, as if it were alive, its energy always demanding more from him. Despite the lessons, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was on the horizon. Zahar seemed distracted, always looking over her shoulder, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. It was in the way her eyes flicked to the horizon, or how she seemed to listen for something that was just out of reach. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something was coming, something that would test both him and the sword in ways they weren't prepared for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the distant hills, casting long shadows over the Shirik capital, the calm was shattered by a sudden alert. The palace's warning systems blared to life, and Marcus rushed to Zahar's side. She stood before a large holographic map of the galaxy, her face tight with concern. "The Frozen," she said, her voice cold as ice. "The Frozen?" Marcus repeated, confused. He had heard of them. An ancient enemy of the Shirik, a race known for their cunning and ruthlessness. They were a species that had waged war against the Shirik centuries ago, but had vanished after a decisive defeat. It seemed impossible that they could be back. Zahar's expression darkened. "They have found us," she said quietly, "and they have come for the sword." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The sword. Why? Zahar's hand hovered over the map, and a red blip blinked on the display. The Frozen believe that the sword holds the key to an ancient power, a power that could make them unstoppable. They want it for themselves, to conquer not just our people, but the entire galaxy. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. And they know it's here. They know, Zahar confirmed, her voice low and tense. They have been searching for the sword for centuries, and now that it has been returned, they will stop at nothing to take it. The room fell silent, and Marcus felt the weight of the situation settle around him. The sword was no longer just a relic. It was the focal point of a galactic struggle. He had been pulled into something far bigger than himself, and now his decisions would have consequences not just for him, but for countless others. Zahar turned to him, her eyes sharp and calculating. We must prepare. The Throzen will come soon, and when they do, they will not show mercy. Marcus swallowed hard. He wasn't a soldier. He had never been trained for a battle like this. But the sword in his hand was more than just a symbol. It was a weapon, and he had to learn how to wield it, or else everything he cared about could be lost. We'll fight, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Zahar nodded, her gaze never leaving him. Yes, we will fight. But we must be smart. The Throzen are not to be underestimated. They have power, but they are also cunning. We will need to outthink them, not just outfight them. Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the power of the sword hum beneath his touch. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This battle would decide the fate of more than just the Shirk. It would determine the future of the galaxy itself. The Throzen were coming, and Marcus could feel the weight of the sword growing heavier in his hand. The journey was just beginning, and the true test of his strength and will had yet to come. The night before the expected arrival of the Throzen was eerily quiet. Marcus stood on one of the palace balconies, staring at the twin moons that hung in the sky. Their silvery light bathed the city below, making the Shirk capital seem peaceful, even as the threat of war loomed closer. He tightened his grip on the sword, now sheathed at his side, feeling its faint hum of energy. It wasn't just a weapon, it was alive, and it seemed to grow restless as the hours passed. Your thoughts are loud, human, came Zahar's voice from behind him. Marcus turned to find the queen standing there, her imposing figure framed by the glow of the moons. She wasn't wearing her usual ceremonial armor. Instead, she had donned a simple cloak, her face uncharacteristically calm. For a moment, she looked less like a queen and more like a weary warrior preparing for yet another battle. I can't stop thinking about it, Marcus admitted. This sword, this war, the Throzen. What if I'm not ready for this? Zahar stepped closer, her gaze sharp but not unkind. No one is ever ready for the burdens they must carry, she said. But readiness is not what determines victory. It is your will to endure, to rise when others fall, that matters. Marcus let her words sink in, but the doubt in his heart lingered. What if I fail? Zahar studied him for a moment before reaching to her belt and drawing a shorter blade, one that gleamed in the moonlight. She handed it to him. Then let us see how far you've come. What? Marcus asked, startled. We train, Zahar said simply. If you are to face the Throzen, you must learn to wield the sword properly. Power without control is nothing but chaos, and chaos will destroy you. Marcus hesitated, but he took the blade she offered. It felt strange in his hand, lighter than the sword but still perfectly balanced. Zahar drew her own weapon, a curved blade that seemed to hum with the same energy as the sword. She moved to the center of the balcony and gestured for him to follow. Defend yourself, she commanded. What now? Marcus asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm not ready for. Zahar didn't wait. She lunged, her blade cutting through the air with startling speed. Marcus barely had time to raise his weapon to block. The clash of metal rang out, and the force of the blow nearly knocked him off his feet. Do not hesitate, Zahar said, her voice firm. Hesitation will cost you everything. Marcus gritted his teeth and adjusted his stance. She attacked again, this time faster, and he struggled to keep up. Her movements were precise and fluid, while his were clumsy and uncertain. But as they sparred, he began to notice patterns in her strikes, small openings he could exploit. He started to anticipate her movements, and though he was far from matching her skill, he managed to hold his ground. After what felt like hours, Zuhar lowered her blade and stepped back. Marcus was breathing hard, sweat dripping down his face, but he was still standing. "You are not hopeless," she said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "There is potential in you, Marcus. The sword sees it, and now I see it too." Marcus straightened, feeling a flicker of pride despite his exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "Do not thank me yet," Star replied. "The Frozen will not go easy on you. But tonight, you've taken your first step toward becoming more than you were. Remember this feeling and carry it into battle." As Zihar turned to leave, Marcus looked down at the sword at his side. For the first time, he didn't feel like it was a burden. It was a challenge, and one he was starting to believe he could face. The day had come. Marcus stood at the top of the palace's highest tower, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond the capital's walls. The sky had darkened with the approach of the Frozen fleet. The peaceful quiet of the day was now pierced by the distant hum of the engines that cut through the atmosphere. They were coming. The ancient enemies had returned, and with them, the threat of war. Zihar stood beside him, her posture as rigid as ever, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her expression was unreadable, though Marcus could feel the tension in the air. She had prepared for this moment her entire life, but now that it was here, even she seemed uncertain. "They're close," Marcus said, his voice low. Zihar nodded, her gaze fixed on the approaching fleet. "They have underestimated us before. This time, they will not make the same mistake." But Marcus could hear the edge in her voice. He knew that even she couldn't predict how this battle would go. The Frozen were ruthless and cunning. They had been a threat to the Sheriff for centuries, and now they were back, stronger and more determined than ever. And all because of the sword, because of the power it held. The Frozen ships broke through the clouds, their dark silhouettes now clearly visible in the sky. They were massive, with jagged edges and a menacing design that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. There were hundreds of them, all descending toward the city like vultures circling their prey. Zihar turned to Marcus, her eyes hard. "It is time." He nodded, feeling the weight of the sword at his side. The energy of it was more intense now, almost as if it recognized the threat, and was eager to join the fight. But Marcus had learned the hard way that power was not something to be rushed into. He had to control it, or risk being consumed by it. The battle would not be fought just with blades and weapons. It would be fought with strategy, intelligence, and a steady hand. The Frozen might have strength on their side, but Marcus had learned from Zuhar there was always more to victory than just force. The Sheriff fleet had already mobilized, their ships rising into the sky to meet the enemy. Zuhar and Marcus, along with a group of her most trusted soldiers, boarded their own vessel. It was sleek and silent, the perfect match for the Sheriff's advanced technology. They flew toward the heart of the battlefield, where the Frozen ships had begun to form a massive, menacing blockade. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as the battle loomed closer. He had never fought in a war like this before. The sword, now pulsing with energy, seemed to sense his unease. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a presence, almost as if it were alive, whispering to him, urging him to wield its power. But Marcus held back. The sword was not his to control blindly. It was a tool that could either save them or destroy them. He had to remain focused, to think ahead, and not let the sword's power cloud his judgment. As the Sheriff ship neared the heart of the battle, the first Frozen ships fired, their weapons tearing through the air with destructive force. The Sheriff ship veered to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. The fight had begun. Zihar looked at Marcus, her face set in grim determination. "Stay close to me. Let us see what you've learned." Marcus nodded, the weight of his responsibility settling in once more. He wasn't just a diplomat anymore, and he wasn't just a soldier. He was the bearer of the sword. And whether he was ready or not, this battle would decide everything. The fate of the Sherrick, and perhaps the entire galaxy, rested in his hands. The battle erupted with a roar. Marcus felt the vibrations of the blasts through the hull of their ship as it dodged another wave of enemy fire. The air was thick with the hum of engines, the crackling of energy shields, and the constant whine of weapons being discharged. The Frozen were relentless, their ships circling like vultures, launching attack after attack without pause. But the Sherrick were ready, their advanced technology countering each strike, staying one step ahead in the game of war. Marcus gripped the hilt of the sword, his fingers tightening as the familiar hum surged through him. The power of the sword seemed to resonate with the chaos around him, calling him to action. But he held back. Zhar had warned him. It wasn't about just using power, it was about control. He had to keep his focus, even as the world around him seemed to fall apart. The Frozen ships were massive, their jagged forms cutting through the sky with menacing speed. They had a unique advantage, speed and firepower. But the Sherrick had something more: precision, technology, and the ancient power of the sword. Zhar's ship weaved in and out of the battlefield, her crew expertly firing back at the Frozen forces. Her calm, precise commands echoed through the ship's communication system. Marcus could feel the weight of her experience. She had been through this before. She had seen the destruction that the Frozen could bring. But now she was relying on him too. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in this battle, and his actions would make the difference. The moment he had been dreading came sooner than expected. A Frozen ship broke through the defensive line, heading straight for their ship with its weapons locked and ready to fire. Without thinking, Marcus unsheathed the sword, feeling the power surge through him like a current of electricity. The sword vibrated in his grip as if it recognized the danger. "Marcus," Zhar shouted over the comms, "stay focused. We need you to defend, not attack recklessly." Marcus barely heard her. The sword was calling to him, urging him to strike. Without realizing it, he thrust the blade forward, sending a burst of energy from the sword straight at the oncoming Frozen ship. The energy blast hit the enemy vessel with explosive force, sending it spiraling out of control. The ship broke apart in a fiery explosion, debris scattering across the battlefield. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, staring at the wreckage. He hadn't meant to do that. It was like the sword had acted on its own, its energy consuming him for a moment. He realized, too late, that he had let his instincts take over, and the consequences of his actions were now clear. Zhar's voice cut through his shock. "Marcus, what have you done?" He turned to her, his heart racing. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." Zhar's eyes narrowed, but there was no time for reprimands. A new threat emerged from the chaos. More Frozen ships were closing in, and they were not going to let up. "We cannot afford mistakes like this," she said, her voice hard. "If the sword takes control of you, we will lose everything." Marcus nodded, fear gripping him. The sword's power was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous. He had to learn to control it, if not for his sake, then for the sake of everyone aboard the ship, and for the entire galaxy. The battle raged on, with Marcus now fully aware of the risks he was facing. The sword's power was too much for any one person to control easily, but he had no choice. There was no turning back. As the Frozen forces closed in, Marcus gripped the sword tightly, focusing on his training, on Zhar's words, and on the task at hand. "Stay with me," Zhar commanded. "We will finish this together." Marcus didn't answer. His mind was clear now, his focus sharp. He was ready to face whatever came next. With a deep breath, he raised the sword once more. This time, it was not the sword controlling him. It was him controlling the sword. The air was thick with the sound of battle. Ships crisscrossed the sky like bright shooting stars, explosions lighting up the dark expanse of space. The Throzen were relentless, their ships firing in perfect unison, as if they had practiced this attack for centuries. Marcus felt the tension in the air. Every movement, every command felt like it could be the one that decided the outcome of the war. He stood at Sahar's side, the sword now an extension of his own will. It hummed with energy, urging him to strike, to use the power that lay just beneath the surface. But Marcus had learned something in the chaos of battle. This was not a weapon to be used recklessly. Each swing, each burst of energy, had its consequences. The sword was a force of nature, and if he didn't learn to control it fully, it would control him. They were surrounded. The Sherrick fleet had held its ground for as long as possible, but the Throzen had begun to push forward, their ships closing in like a tidal wave. Zahar's ship swerved, narrowly avoiding another barrage of enemy fire, and Marcus could see the strain on her face. "We cannot hold them off much longer," she said through gritted teeth. "We need to finish this. Now." Marcus glanced at the enemy ships. There were too many of them. The battle was slipping away from them. If the Throzen were allowed to press their advantage, they would destroy the Sherrick and take control of the galaxy. But Marcus knew that with the sword in his hands, there was still hope. If only he could find the strength to harness its power without losing himself to it. Zahar glanced at him, her eyes hard with determination. "It is time to end this." Marcus hesitated. The power was right there, ready to be unleashed. The sword pulsed in his grip, its energy wrapping around his very being, urging him to act. But something held him back. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. Not after what had happened when he lost control earlier. "Marcus," Zahar said urgently, "trust in the sword. Trust in yourself. You've already come so far." He swallowed hard. This was it. There would be no second chances. Marcus closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the sword, letting the power flow through him. He didn't try to control it. Instead, he let it guide him, felt it merge with his will. It was terrifying. Powerful, yes, but it felt right. He was ready to face it now. With a deep breath, Marcus raised the sword high. He could feel the energy building within him, building within the sword. The air crackled, and the sword's hum grew louder. It was like the sword was singing, its power singing in harmony with his own heartbeat. The Throzen were closing in, but Marcus didn't flinch. He was ready. "Now," Zahar shouted. Marcus thrust the sword forward, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. A burst of brilliant light erupted from the blade, so bright that it seemed to tear through the fabric of space itself. The light spread outward, sweeping across the battlefield like a tidal wave, washing over the Throzen ships in its path. The power of the sword surged through the enemy fleet, disintegrating their ships in an instant. The explosion was deafening. The sky lit up with fiery destruction as the Throzen forces were torn apart. Marcus felt the sword's power ripple through him, and for a moment, he thought he might lose himself to it. But somehow, he held on, grounding himself in the present, in the fight. The light faded, and silence fell. Zahar's voice broke through the stillness. "You did it." Marcus lowered the sword, his body trembling with exhaustion. His heart raced, and he felt drained, but the battle was over. The Throzen fleet had been decimated, their ships broken apart, their forces scattered. The Sherrick had won, but at a cost. The sword's power had taken everything from him. He knew it. The cost of victory was steep, but they had survived. For now, the galaxy was safe, but Marcus knew the sword was not done with him. The power within it had only just begun to show its true nature. The road ahead would not be easy. The war might be over, but the true battle had just begun. The battle had ended, but the silence that followed was more unsettling than any explosion. Marcus stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the wreckage of the Throzen fleet floating in space. The once menacing ships were now nothing more than twisted metal, their power gone, their crew defeated. The Sherrick had won, but Marcus knew it wasn't a clean victory. The cost was high, and there was no telling what the future held. Zahar approached him, her face still set in a stern expression, though there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. "You did well," she said, her voice softer than it had been before. But her words didn't ease the weight on Marcus's shoulders. He could still feel the sword's power pulsing beneath his skin, its energy swirling inside him. It was as if it had become a part of him, a part he couldn't escape. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. His hand still trembled from the force of the power he had unleashed. Zahar studied him for a long moment, as if deciding how much to say. "The Frozen are no longer a threat to us. For now, we have won. But the sword, it is not just a weapon. It is a force, one that will continue to call to you. You must learn to live with it, or it will consume you." Marcus looked down at the sword in his hands, still sheathed at his side. He could feel its presence, its power, as if it were waiting for the next battle. He had used it to destroy the Frozen, but what if it was too much? What if it turned on him, like it had almost done before? "How do I control it?" he asked, the question coming out more desperate than he intended. Zahar's eyes softened. "Control is not the answer, Marcus. Understanding is. The sword is ancient, powerful, but it is not invincible. It is tied to the very fabric of the universe. You must learn to live with it, not fight against it." Marcus frowned. "I don't understand." "Few do," Zahar replied. "The sword was forged in a time before the stars themselves. It was created for a purpose you have only just begun to understand. You wield it now, but it is not just a tool. It is a part of something much bigger, something beyond the scope of any one person or even an entire species. That is why it calls to you. It recognizes your potential." Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm. The sword had chosen him. He had been its bearer, its chosen one, from the moment it had been returned to the Sheriff. But that didn't make it any easier to handle. "The power. It feels like it's still inside me," Marcus said quietly. "Like it's waiting for me to use it again." Zahar nodded, her expression serious. "It will always be there, Marcus. But you are not just the sword's wielder. You are its guardian now. It is a responsibility you must accept, whether you like it or not. The sword is a key, and it will unlock things you may not be ready for. The galaxy is full of dangers, and this is just the beginning." Marcus looked out at the stars, his mind racing. He had thought the battle was over, that the war was won. But Zahar was right. This was only the beginning. The sword had power beyond anything he had imagined, and that power was not just his to command. It was a force that would shape the future, whether he was ready for it or not. As the Sheriff fleet returned to their homeworld, Marcus stood at the window of their ship, looking out at the endless expanse of space. The galaxy seemed peaceful now, but he knew that peace was fragile. The sword, still pulsing with power, was a reminder that nothing in this galaxy stayed quiet for long. The real journey had just begun, and Marcus was the one who would lead them into the unknown. The stars outside the ship flickered like tiny diamonds, scattered across an endless velvet sky. Marcus stood alone in the observation deck, his mind a whirl of thoughts. The battle with the Frozen was over, but the real weight of the future was just beginning to settle on his shoulders. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The sword, the powerful, dangerous weapon he had come to depend on, was no longer just a tool. It was a living force, one that had chosen him. And with that choice came responsibility. Zahar had given him a gift, but it was also a curse. She had told him that he was its guardian now, that the sword was more than a weapon. It was a key to something much larger, something he didn't yet understand, and that terrified him. He glanced down at the sword, still resting by his side, its dark blade seeming to glow faintly in the dim light of the room. The hum of its energy was subtle, but unmistakable. It felt like a living thing, a presence that was always with him. It had given him the strength to defeat the Frozen. But now he wondered, what else could it do? What if he wasn't ready to face whatever it might unlock? Marcus, Zhar's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and commanding. It's time. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face as unreadable as ever. But there was a softness in her eyes now, a flicker of something that he hadn't seen before. She had seen the price of leadership, how it could change a person. Marcus was no longer the diplomat he had once been. He had become something else, something more. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Marcus admitted, his voice low. The sword, it's not just a weapon. It's a part of something bigger. What if I lose control? Zhar stepped forward, her expression steady. The sword chose you for a reason. You may not fully understand its purpose yet, but it has seen your potential. You have the strength to wield it, Marcus. But that strength will only come through understanding. You are not alone in this. Her words, though simple, had a deep weight to them. They gave him a sense of reassurance, even if only for a moment. He wasn't alone. He had Zohar and her people, and he had the power of the sword. But most importantly, he had his own strength. It was something he would have to learn to rely on, just as much as he relied on the sword. We're heading to the capital, Zhar said, her voice serious once again. There is much to discuss. The victory over the Frozen is just the beginning. The galaxy has been changed, and there are new threats waiting for us. Marcus nodded, his mind focusing on the road ahead. He had faced the Frozen, but he knew now that this was only one chapter in a much larger story. The sword was just the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the ship moved toward the Sherrick capital, Marcus turned his gaze back to the stars outside. They seemed so distant, so vast, but now they felt more like a promise than a mystery. The galaxy was full of unknowns, but he would face them with the sword at his side. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a legacy. And now it was his to protect. With one last look at the endless expanse of space, Marcus knew that whatever the future held, he was ready to face it. The sword would guide him, but his will would be the key. And with that, a new chapter began. The end.